is a question around assessments of states' citizenship. Citizen responsibility is part of what we're interested in, and I'll speak a little bit less to that today. And this is based on work we've been conducting over the past several years in underserved settlements around Cape Town and also around the city of Accra in Ghana. And some of my partners and collaborators for this particular paper are listed here at the bottom, and you can find more on our website, which is also at the bottom. So the broader project of which this is a part is interested in everyday and lived experiences of water access, especially in the context of neoliberalized water governance. But we're doing so after having done other projects that look more broadly at neoliberal water governance. We're doing it so from the perspective, again, of everyday engagements, lived experience, and also with particular focus on underserved or potentially vulnerable or marginalized communities in the context of those shifts. So when I say neoliberal water governance, here I'm really most interested in the whole array: privatization, commodification, marketization of water, but also devolution, decentralized water governance. The emphasis on participatory water governance are the major themes that we're looking at. So these are some of the goals of the broader project. And here we have a specific emphasis on questions of narrative, how people choose to narrate those shifts and what's important for them, what meanings people attach to different modes of access for water, ideas around inclusion or exclusion, social belonging as mediated through water access. And we're also interested in engaging the policy debates around participatory governance and expanding access in particular. So what I'll be reporting on today in the context of that broader work is based on a survey that we conducted in 2012. And in the end, we have 478 surveys that we're using for the analysis. This was collected in 2 sites around Cape Town, Kaibunja and Baliki, and 2 sites, Ashaiman and Teshi in Accra. And some other information is here. And I'll mention very briefly some work, but we have done a lot more qualitative work as well. So I'm going to stay in the quantitative domain for this presentation, but the master's thesis of several students that are on the qualitative dimensions are all available online as well at that website. So just to give you a sense, I mentioned that Ashaiman and Teshi are the 2 sites where we did the survey in the context of Accra. Ashaiman is farther afield, peri-urban settlement. Teshi is an older community, more central in Accra. And the other sites are some of the sites where the qualitative work has also been undertaken. So the questions that I'm mainly interested in speaking to today are these. So how do people invoke ideas of state and also citizen responsibility or their own responsibility linked with service delivery, water quality, and access? What can we learn actually by illuminating what's similar and different across these sites? And I'll say from the get-go, I'm fully aware that the sites are very different in multiple ways, many different registers, but I'm also just interested when we put them in the same frame, when we pose the same questions to communities that are generally underserved in both of these sites, what comes to the light, which issues are more important? And to me, that's precisely around illuminating contextual difference and understanding. So some of these issues are much more animated in the different contexts in different ways. So I think we can learn from that to think about some general insights around questions of access and participatory governance. And I'll only speak briefly today, but again, one of the concepts that animates the broader project is what can we learn for broader debates around neoliberalized natures, theories of the states, environmental citizenship. And that's where I do have to do some more work, so I welcome your comments as well in terms of situating, especially this quantitative work in the context of those broader debates. So some of the debates that inform, again, our approach and why I'm interested in making these connections between water access, governance, and states and citizenship are these literatures around everyday stateness, again, meanings in the everyday senses around something as abstract as the state. Political ecologies of the state, which is a debate that's becoming more enlivened in recent moments. I'm working on a special issue on that right now as well. And then some of the issues around environmental citizenship. So how people talk about environmental issues as being meaningful for themselves, or what sorts of activism and engagement people undertake in their communities. And there's also some work that's really interested more explicitly in thinking about citizenship and infrastructure. So that's really where I situate this as well. Okay, so I mentioned that there are really important contextual differences. Many of you, I'm sure, know quite a lot about that. I'll just highlight 1 or 2 in terms of what's happening in terms of water access for some of these communities in Accra and around Cape Town. So in Accra, you did have the 5-year privatization that was mandated by loan conditionalities from some of the international financial institutions that ended in 2011. You also have a very considerable deficit in terms of the supply, so estimates are all over the board, but maybe half of the community within Accra is served by the actual pipe network. The rest would be through extensions, through vending, sachet markets, and other sorts of extensions. You also, within the system itself, you also, half of the water is unaccounted for, so meaning that it's not paid or known where it goes. So considerable deficits across the board and highly differentiated and unequal access, as you can imagine, by community according to income and other notions of difference. And so we purposely chosen communities where we know that there's relatively poor access. And then in Cape Town, as many of you know, there's a different policy context around free basic water. I won't get into a lot of details, but very important for what we're talking about here. The active protest is very much also part of what we need to think about in terms of the contestation over different questions around delivery and access. But by the formal numbers, things look relatively good, and that supposedly 88% have access to pipe water within the Joint Monitoring Program standards. And some of the work, especially the qualitative work that's done by Lucy Rodina in Kailija, has really emphasized differences between shack dwellers and those who live in IDP homes as being some of the important demarcations of difference that matter for the narratives around access. So just to give you some quick portraits again that emerged from the survey, and you know, there's a lot of things we could pick apart, but I just want to give you a general portrait. So here is responses to the question of is water affordable. You can see that in Ghana, we have strong disagreement with over 50% saying they strongly disagree. There's some interesting things going on here. It would take a while to unpack that. Considerable proportions of respondents in South Africa said they wish not to answer, probably because Kailija, which is one of our 2 sites, people are not currently paying for water. But there's other things that might be happening there. A couple other quick touch points before I go to the rest of the analysis and discussion is just to give a sense, for instance, that about half of our respondents in Accra say they rely on vendors as their primary source of water. It would actually be more if you consider the whole strategy portfolio that people undertake, because this was the question primarily. We also have the other data in terms of the range of access that they engage. You can see here that to the question, is water easy to access? 64% in Ghana either disagree or strongly disagree. So strong sense that's a considerable labor and effort to access water. By contrast, in South Africa, 83% agreed or strongly agreed that it's relatively easy to access water. And here, as many of you know, there's zero reliance on vendors in these communities that we surveyed. So again, just to visualize some of this, you can see the 2 most important points are probably at the 2 ends. So in Ghana, the heavy reliance on vendors there, and then in South Africa, a range of different connections, including in-yard connection. There was relatively few in our survey that actually had the in-home connection, which is occurring increasingly with formalization in RDP homes. So getting to the question of how can we understand these linkages between states, how people view the state, and is this mediated at all by their sense of satisfaction or quality of the water that they're accessing. And I don't want to oversimplify what we know is a very complex entanglement and complex point, but we're just looking at what does our data suggest around the relationship and the linkage between, for instance, quality of water and trust in government. So let's just look at a couple of those data points to speak to that, which again is a very complex question. But we do see, for instance, if we're looking in general, that more people responded that they trust government officials in South Africa than among our Ghanaian respondents. So 55% in Ghana said they do not trust the government officials, compared to 33% of the South African respondents. In South Africa, we also see, relative to Ghana, higher levels of trust in NGOs and trust in others in the community as well. The proportion or subset of the population that was most trusting in these different categories were females in South Africa, female respondents. So just to visualize some of the data around the trust, the things just to emphasize here is the people who said trust them fully, there's not a strong difference between Ghanaian and South African respondents, but where you see it is in the not trusting So 32% in South Africa said they don't trust compared to the 55% in Ghana. So looking at some crosstabs where we're precisely looking at satisfaction with water, notions of clean water access, and trust in government officials. So let's look in Ghana. Of those who said they were dissatisfied with their water, and I'll have to remind myself of that overall number, twice as many within that subset said that they don't trust government versus trusting government. If you look on the other side, those who say they have good quality water, you see 50% more trust in government as opposed to those who do not. So there is some relationship here in terms of how those are correlated. And again, this is not causal in terms of the type of statistical analysis. So again, if you look in South Africa, 22% say they're dissatisfied with the water service, but still you see 33% more among that population says that they trust compared to those who don't trust. So again, this is a little bit less than the 50% in South Africa overall who trust. So you see some diminishment in the trust, but it's not wholesale. It's not fully aligned, again, as you can imagine. But of those that are satisfied, we do see, again, on the flip side, more people are trusting of the government compared to those who do not. So we did a number of other analyses, and the next step that we're going to do is actually to do some models and tests, working with some statisticians to see about these relationships more fully beyond the crosstabs. But we're seeing here some complexity, but in both country contexts, quality of water, satisfaction with water is correlated at some level with trust in government, but it's a bit complex in terms of, again, the different demographics and other factors. So thinking about state-society relations, in general, we have some other things that we can look at from the survey data. One is, where would you go if you had a water-related problem? So here, majority in South Africa said they'd go to a local counselor, and only 26% in Ghana gave that answer. In fact, the Ghanaian respondents were all over the map, with a fair number saying they would go to a family friend, they wouldn't do anything. So that suggests to me that there's not as clear pathways in terms of accountability and transparency in terms of where one goes when there's a concern or issue in the Ghanaian context, which speaks to the broader governance terrain there. We asked people directly, when you have access to water, do you feel differently towards your local government? We also asked for national government. And similar proportions in the two country contexts said yes, they do feel differently. And we followed that up with qualitative, open-ended responses, which we've yet to analyze. And so here, the question was phrased a little differently because of my semi-government collaborator, which says I'm proud of my government when we have access to water. So 45% responded yes in South Africa. So looking at a little bit of those qualitative follow-up answers, just to give you a sense, these were just grabbed from the Ghanaian responses. No, I don't feel that differently because the government's not doing enough. So we can't even invest that much in the yes-no answer in terms of what that means, because people said, I don't feel differently because it's their duty to supply water, for instance. So, I think that there is a relationship, and we'll have to do more of that qualitative work again to unpack that. One of the highlights or thing that's very clear from the data, even though a lot of the rest is very complex, is that the strong majority in both contexts say the government should be doing more. So this is true even among those who are very satisfied with their water or think they have clean water. So just looking again, 75% of the respondents in Ghana said their water is clean, but of those 95% still said they think the government should be doing more. So again, that sense of government responsibility, I think, comes out quite loudly from the analysis. And again, there's the strong government agreement. So in the broader, just to say one or two things about more directed at citizenship, again, some of the work that Lucy Rojinan has done in Kailija has actually seems to suggest that some of the RDP homeowners do sort of adopt this idea a bit more strongly in terms of their own responsibility. In fact, at some level, acceptance of payment for services is part of what it would mean to have the in-home tap. So there is this discourse a lot about conservation of water that she sees that sort of reflects probably the educational campaigns and other things that have been going on in that context. And I think what we need to do is look much more, especially in the context of neoliberalization, where there is this focus on individual responsibility, community responsibility. To what degree do we see that in terms of either protest discourses or in terms of individuals and how they talk about whether or not that's an acceptable framework or if there's resistance in different ways. So we're interested in looking more at that citizenship question from that perspective. Just to speak to other neoliberalization processes and things that came out from the data, I think that these are quite interesting, especially to compare the context. So this is from Ghana. We said water should be free for everyone, disagree or agree. And you see here fairly strong disagreement that water should be free. And again, these are among what you might consider the most impoverished population, people who are clearly struggling for access to water. So this is not the whole sample, including rich populations. In fact, it's from among those that we might expect there would be a sense that water should be free. By contrast, this question in South Africa, again, this speaks to the discursive and political landscape, including other expectations post-apartheid and the protests that you see here very soon. Oh, I didn't see the time. Okay, I'm sorry. I will conclude. I just heard this time. I'm sorry, I didn't see my warnings. So again, very strong difference in terms of the discourse and sense here. So I'll just make one or two quick points of conclusion. The first is, I think in terms of method, I'll just emphasize what some people in the gender panel said previously about the importance of looking at, especially communities that might be underserved, to focus on those communities as an important site for thinking about policies and what the effects of these major shifts are. I also think it's really important to look across contexts to think about variation and neoliberalization, so how these are happening differently in different places and how they precisely intersect with different cultural and historical contexts in different times and places. And I think what's obvious is clearly, I think access to water is one important point to think about changing state-society relations, but of course there's many more things going on there. And I think that's reflected in the data in terms of this being partially explanatory, but not